David's voice shouted, desperate. "You think you've won, Margaret. You'll regret this. You're nothing without me." The sound of his voice echoed in my ears long after he stormed out of the room. But in that moment, I realized something I had never allowed myself to feel before: power. I'm Margaret Turner, and this is the story of how I went from being a woman broken by betrayal to someone who took back everything I deserved. Every sacrifice, every tear, every moment I spent supporting him, all of it was about to come full circle. David thought he could leave me, replace me, walk away with it all. He was wrong. And now? Now it was time for him to feel what it was like to be left behind. It was a Sunday afternoon, a quiet moment after a long week of school runs, grocery shopping, and household chores. I was in the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air as I prepared dinner for my husband David. His favorite: roast chicken with mashed potatoes and a side of green beans. I always tried to make his meals exactly the way he liked them, as if it was my job to keep him happy, to make everything in our home feel perfect. We had been married for 22 years, and for most of that time I had given everything to our family. Every sacrifice, every hour spent keeping the house in order, every dollar I earned from side jobs to pay for our kids' education. It was all for him, for us. I had always believed in the idea of marriage, in the promises we made to each other when we were young, in love, and eager to start a family. David walked into the kitchen, looking distracted. He had just returned from an afternoon meeting with a potential client. He had his work face on, the one he always wore when something important was at stake. It was a look I had grown accustomed to over the years. He kissed me on the cheek absent-mindedly and dropped his briefcase by the door, then glanced at the dinner table. "Looks great as always," he said, though his tone was more flat than usual. I smiled, though there was a knot forming in my stomach. Something was off. I could feel it. I had learned to trust my instincts over the years, especially when it came to David. He had become distant lately, less affectionate, less engaged. There were days when I felt like we were two strangers living under the same roof, but I didn't want to admit it. I still believed we could make it through the rough patch. As we sat down at the table, David didn't touch his food immediately. Instead, he stared at his plate, swirling his mashed potatoes absent-mindedly. I watched him, waiting for him to say something, anything that would ease the growing discomfort between us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David looked up at me. His eyes were different, hesitant, almost apologetic. "Margaret," he began, his voice low, "I need to talk to you about something important." My heart sank. I had no idea what was coming. The tone in his voice told me this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. I've been seeing someone else," he said quietly, avoiding my gaze as if he couldn't bear to look at me. His words hit me like a cold slap across the face, freezing me in place. My hand trembled as I set down my fork, the noise of it hitting the plate sounding far too loud in the silence that followed. I felt the room close in on me, my ears ringing with the weight of his confession. "What?" I whispered, barely able to get the word out. My voice cracked, and I could feel the sting of tears rising in my throat. "I've been seeing someone else. Her name's Emily. She's younger, and we're—" He hesitated for a moment, then continued, "We're in love. I can't keep doing this anymore, Margaret." I sat there, completely stunned, as the words continued to echo in my mind. In love? The man I had spent over 2 decades with, the father of my children, was leaving me for someone younger. The betrayal felt like a punch to the stomach. "But David," I choked, struggling to find the right words, my chest tightening with the ache that threatened to swallow me whole. "What about everything we built? What about our family, our life?" He didn't look at me. His eyes were trained on the table, as if looking anywhere but at me would make this easier. But it didn't. Nothing about this was easy. I know this is hard, but I've made my decision, he said, his voice now tinged with a mix of guilt and finality. I'm leaving, Margaret. I could feel my heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. The years of shared memories, the quiet mornings with coffee and newspapers, the laughter of our children at the dinner table, all of it was being ripped away from me in a single moment. David, please, I whispered, barely able to speak through the tears. You can't just leave me like this, after everything we've been through. I'm sorry, he said again, this time with more conviction, his voice colder. I'm just done. I've met someone who makes me feel alive again. I can't go back. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. So what? You think this is all my fault? You think I haven't been there for you, for us, for the kids? You think I didn't try? I gave you everything, David, and this is how you repay me. He didn't respond. There was nothing left for him to say. I could feel the tears streaming down my face, hot and angry. You're leaving me for her, I whispered, my voice breaking. And you think she's going to be there for you when the next crisis hits, when the real life starts? David didn't answer. He just stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked toward the door. I watched him, unable to move, unable to process the depth of this betrayal. As he opened the door to leave, he paused for a moment and turned to look at me one last time. I'm sorry, Margaret, but it's over. And with that, he was gone. This was the moment my world shattered. The man I had spent my life with, the man I had sacrificed so much for, was leaving me for someone else. And in that moment, something inside me clicked. I was no longer just a wife. I was someone who deserved more, someone who had been pushed to the edge but was now forced to stand up and fight for what was rightfully mine. But David had no idea what was coming next. The door slammed shut behind David, and for a moment I stood there, frozen in the empty silence. My mind raced, thoughts tumbling over each other like an avalanche of confusion and pain. I couldn't make sense of it. How had we gone from a happy family to this? The house felt so much emptier now. It was as if every corner of our home was mocking me, mocking the life I had built with him, mocking every dinner I made, every late night I stayed up to manage the bills, every sacrifice I'd ever made. I couldn't breathe. I sank to the floor, clutching my chest as tears spilled down my face. I had given everything to David, every ounce of my youth, my energy, my time. I had spent years raising our children, working late hours at odd jobs when things got tough, and constantly putting his needs before my own. And this was how it ended. This was my reward for everything I had done. I wiped my eyes and forced myself to stand. I couldn't let this defeat me. Not completely. I had to figure out what was next. I had to survive. I had to make sense of this shattered life. That night, as I lay in bed, alone for the first time in years, I couldn't shake the feeling that David wasn't telling me the whole truth. There was something about the way he left, his sudden coldness, the way he barely looked at me, that didn't add up. He had to have been planning this for a while. The next day, I went through the motions of life. I made breakfast for the kids, kept up appearances for the neighbors, but in the back of my mind, a question gnawed at me. What about the money? For years, David had been the primary earner, and I had put everything into managing our home. I had never questioned the finances, never asked about savings or investments. I trusted him with all of that. But now, as the weight of his betrayal settled in, I realized that I didn't even know where we stood financially. If David had been hiding money from me, I had to find it. I couldn't just sit by and let him walk away with everything, not when he had taken so much from me already. I called my lawyer, Helen, who had handled some minor legal matters for us in the past. She was a no-nonsense woman with a sharp mind and a warm smile, and I knew I could trust her. Margaret, I'm so sorry to hear about what's happening, but listen to me. This isn't over, she told me firmly on the phone. You have rights. You've worked just as hard as David to build this life. Don't let him walk away without fighting for what's yours." Her words gave me the strength I needed. The first thing we did was review our prenuptial agreement, which David had insisted we sign all those years ago. I had always trusted him and never thought to question it, but now I had to know exactly what I was entitled to. What I discovered shocked me. The prenuptial agreement was vague on several matters, but there were clauses about the division of assets in case of divorce. And buried deep in those pages was one crucial detail. David had a trust fund, one he had never mentioned. A trust fund. I had always assumed that everything we had was joint property, but David had been hiding an entire fortune, one that was meant to secure his future, not just mine. I didn't know the full extent of the trust yet, but the discovery was a game changer. David had always acted like we were struggling. He often complained about how much money we spent, the constant pressure to keep up with the bills, and how much I spent on the kids' education. But now, I was beginning to see the truth. David had never been struggling. He had been hoarding money, preparing for this day. I couldn't just sit idly by while he took it all. I needed to act fast. I scheduled a meeting with Helen to discuss how we could access the trust and what steps I needed to take to protect myself. There was still so much I didn't know about our financial situation, but I was determined to get the answers I needed. That evening, I sat in the kitchen, staring out the window at the garden we had spent years cultivating together. The life I had worked so hard to build was slipping through my fingers, but I wouldn't let it go without a fight. The next morning, I took a deep breath and drove to the courthouse to file for divorce. I wasn't just ending my marriage. I was taking back my life, my independence, and my dignity. I wasn't going to let David or anyone else define who I was anymore. In the days that followed, I began to piece my life back together, slowly but surely. I filed the necessary paperwork for the divorce and arranged for a meeting with the estate planner who handled David's trust. It wasn't easy, emotionally or legally, but I was determined to make sure that I got what I deserved. No more secrets, no more lies. But as I began to reclaim what was mine, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. I wasn't going to let David walk away unscathed, not when he had so callously thrown me away. The more I thought about it, the more I realized one thing. David had no idea what he had unleashed. Days turned into weeks, and as the initial shock of David's departure began to wear off, I found myself slowly but surely getting a grip on my reality. I could no longer afford to let my emotions control me, especially not when I had so much to lose. The children were still in school, and I needed to keep everything together for them. But I also knew that I had to put my own life back in order. The divorce papers were filed, but the real work had just begun. I spent hours at my lawyer's office, reading through documents, checking the finer details of David's trust fund, and gathering information about the wealth I had never known existed. Helen was patient but firm. "Margaret, you've been through a lot, but you need to keep your focus. This is about your future now. You deserve more than just a clean break. You deserve what's yours." I nodded, though my mind was still swirling. The anger I had felt in the immediate aftermath of David's betrayal had slowly morphed into a quiet determination. I wasn't going to let him get away with treating me like this. I had sacrificed so much, and now it was time to claim my share, not out of spite, but because it was right. The truth about the trust fund came in pieces. At first, I didn't believe it when I saw the numbers. How could David have kept this from me? How could he have been hiding this wealth while I had worked so tirelessly, so selflessly for years? The trust was worth millions, millions of dollars, money that had been set aside years ago by an old business partner of David's, a man who had apparently been incredibly wealthy. When I saw the amount, I felt the shock hit me like a cold wave. There it was, an inheritance that was never mentioned, an account that David had kept a secret, hidden from me, hidden from everyone. This was money that should have been part of our family, part of our future, but instead, it had been tucked away, reserved for David and his whims. It was clear now. All those years when he had complained about money, all those times when he told me to cut back, to save more, to work harder. It was never about necessity. It was all about control. He had always known he had this safety net to fall back on, and I had never suspected a thing. I took the trust fund documents, my heart pounding in my chest, and brought them straight to my lawyer. I couldn't let this slip by unnoticed. "Margaret, we're going to get you what you deserve," Helen said after reviewing the documents. "David can't just hide assets like this. You're entitled to a fair share, and we'll make sure you get it." The legal process began in full swing. I filed motions for asset discovery, requested a full inventory of David's accounts, and began preparing for the inevitable legal battle. The papers I had signed years ago were no longer the same. I was no longer the naive wife trusting her husband's word. I was a woman ready to fight for her future. But as I walked out of the lawyer's office clutching the stack of legal papers, I couldn't help but wonder. What had David really expected when he left me? Did he think I would just roll over and accept his betrayal? Did he think I wouldn't fight back? Did he think I was weak? For the first time in a long while, I smiled to myself. I felt a sense of power building inside me, a power that had been buried for years, quietly waiting for its moment to rise. This wasn't just about money. It was about proving to myself that I wasn't the woman he had thought I was. I wasn't just a housewife. I wasn't just a caretaker. I was a woman who could stand on her own, who could rebuild her life from the ashes of her marriage. A few weeks after filing the motions, the truth about David's financial situation began to unfold. He was not only hiding money from me, he had been hiding it from everyone. His business empire was far more successful than he ever let on, and yet he had kept it all to himself. The more I learned, the more disgusted I became with his lies. But the worst part was yet to come. One evening, I received a call from a close friend of David's, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Janet, his old business partner's wife, called to check in. "I heard about the divorce, Margaret," Janet said hesitantly, her voice low. "I don't want to get in the middle of anything, but I think you should know something. David didn't just leave you for Emily. He's planning on using her to take control of everything. Your house, the business, everything. And he's counting on you not fighting back." I was silent for a moment, the words hanging in the air like a sharp blade. He was trying to take everything from me? "Thank you, Janet," I said, my voice steady, but my hands were shaking. This was a turning point. This wasn't just about David's betrayal anymore. This was about taking back what was rightfully mine. I began making plans for the next stage of my life. I wasn't going to just sit around and wait for the divorce to finalize. I wasn't going to wallow in self-pity. I would use this time to build the life I had always dreamed of. A life that was all mine, free from the manipulations of David and his lies. I started looking into investing. I had always loved real estate, but David had always dismissed it as too risky for someone like me. Too risky. He had never thought I was capable of handling money, but now I saw this as my chance to prove him wrong. I didn't need him. I didn't need anyone to tell me what I could or couldn't do. I used part of the money from the trust fund to start small investments, purchasing a few properties in a rising neighborhood. My heart raced with excitement as I saw the first pieces of my new life falling into place. And then I did something I never thought I'd do. I booked a solo trip to Europe. David had always been too busy with work to travel, always too focused on his ambitions to take a vacation. But now I was doing it for me. I would see the world, experience new things, and begin this new chapter fully in control of my destiny. The first time David called after the divorce papers were filed, he was furious. "Margaret, you're being ridiculous," he shouted through the phone. "You really think you can just take everything and walk away? I built everything. You're nothing without me." I let him rant for a while, my anger bubbling beneath the surface. But instead of shouting back, I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I'm not walking away from anything, David," I said calmly. "I'm walking towards something better, and you can't stop me." The line went silent for a long moment before he finally hung up. I wasn't just rebuilding my life, I was taking it back. Piece by piece, I was transforming from the woman who had been quietly sidelined into someone who could stand on her own. Someone who didn't need to rely on anyone else to be happy, successful, or fulfilled. And in that moment, I realized one thing. David had underestimated me. And it was about time he learned just how wrong he was. As the days turned into weeks, my new life began to take shape. The investments, the travel, the small steps toward rebuilding my sense of self. I could feel the weight of the past slowly starting to lift. But there was still something missing. David. The man who had torn our family apart, who had taken everything I had ever worked for, was still out there. And I knew I couldn't let him walk away unscathed. My anger was still simmering beneath the surface. I had spent so many years giving him the best of me, only to have him discard me like I was nothing. And then, to add insult to injury, he left me for someone younger, someone who could never understand what it took to keep a family together. Emily might have the youth and beauty David craved, but she didn't have what I had: experience, wisdom, and the ability to build something meaningful. I had learned a lot in the past few weeks, and I realized I could do far more than just get a divorce settlement. I was no longer just the betrayed wife. I was someone with power. I had resources now, and I could use them to make David regret his decisions. I hadn't told anyone yet about the trust fund. I hadn't even told my kids. But I knew that now was the time to act. I was going to reclaim my life, and in doing so, I was going to show David that he couldn't treat me like I was disposable. I sat at my kitchen table one morning, the papers spread out in front of me. It was time to get serious. The trust fund had given me a new sense of power, but I wasn't going to just use it to pay bills or buy a new house. No, I was going to invest it. Build something for myself that was far greater than anything David could ever have imagined. The first step was to take ownership of our family home. David had always made it clear that he thought he was the sole provider, the one who deserved to control the assets. But the truth was, this house was just as much mine as it was his, and I wasn't going to let him take it without a fight. I met with my lawyer, Helen, once again. She helped me draw up the necessary documents to assert my claim over the house. It wasn't easy, and David fought back fiercely. But I was ready for this battle. I had something far stronger than just legal paperwork. I had determination. I wasn't going to be the one to walk away from everything this time. One rainy afternoon, as I was going over some property documents in the study, I got an unexpected call. It was David. "Margaret, we need to talk," he said, his voice more serious than I'd ever heard it. "I'm coming over." I wasn't surprised by his request, though I knew exactly what it meant. He was coming to try to manipulate me back into submission. I had no intention of giving him what he wanted. I decided I wasn't going to make this easy for him. When David arrived, he seemed almost too calm, too collected. He stepped into the house as if it were still his. No apologies, no acknowledgement of the damage he'd done. His eyes immediately went to the dining table, where I had laid out a series of papers. "I've been thinking," he said, walking toward me, his gaze fixed on mine. "We should just settle this divorce, Margaret. You take your share, and I'll get on with my life. Let's not drag this out." His tone was patronizing, as though he were doing me a favor. The old me, the one who had been emotionally dependent on him, would have agreed. But the woman standing before him now was no longer that person. I stood up slowly, meeting his gaze with a calmness that surprised even me. "David," I said firmly, "you don't get to decide how this ends. You don't get to decide when I'm finished with you." David paused, his expression flickering for a moment. He had expected me to crumble, to beg him to stay, to forgive him. But instead, I was standing tall, reclaiming my space in a way I hadn't done in years. I'm not asking you for anything, Margaret. I'm offering you everything you need. This is your last chance to get out of this without making a scene. I shook my head, my voice low but filled with resolve. I don't need anything from you, David. I've spent my whole life giving you everything, and look where it's gotten me. I'm done. You don't control me anymore. For a moment, he just stared at me, disbelief written across his face. He wasn't used to me being strong, to standing up to him. I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to figure out his next move. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly, almost pleading. "We've been through so much together. Don't do this. I know I hurt you, but—" "But nothing, David," I interrupted, cutting him off. "You hurt me, yes, but more than that, you underestimated me. And that's the mistake you're going to regret for the rest of your life." David didn't know it yet, but I was far from finished. I wasn't going to let him walk away with everything he'd stolen from me. I had a plan, one that would hit him where it hurt the most. Later that week, I made an unexpected purchase, a new home. It wasn't just any house, though. This was a luxury property in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the city. The moment I signed the paperwork, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just a house. This was a statement. David might have thought he was the one who held the power, but in that moment, I knew that I had taken back control, and I wasn't done yet. I began to plan my next move, and this time, it wasn't just about reclaiming my life. It was about ensuring that David understood that he could never again treat me like I was a doormat. As I moved forward with my plans, I knew that this battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't scared. I wasn't angry. I was confident. David might have taken my trust, my marriage, and my future, but he hadn't taken my strength. And now I was going to show him exactly what it meant to cross the wrong woman. It had been a few weeks since I moved into my new home, a stunning 5-bedroom villa nestled in a prime neighborhood, one I'd only ever dreamed of. The sheer opulence of the place reminded me of everything I had been denied for years. It wasn't just a house, it was a victory. It symbolized my newfound independence and the beginning of a life on my own terms. But as peaceful as my new life was becoming, I couldn't shake the feeling that David wasn't done yet. He never really understood the weight of his actions. He'd always assumed that everything would go back to normal, that I would fold under the pressure, apologize, and beg him to come back. But that wasn't who I was anymore. One afternoon, as I was enjoying a quiet cup of coffee in the sunroom, my phone rang. It was David. I almost didn't answer. I had no interest in hearing his voice after everything he had put me through, but something inside me told me I needed to take this call. I wasn't going to be the woman who ran away anymore. I was going to face him head on, just as I had done every other challenge in my life. I answered with a steady voice, my calm demeanor hiding the fire burning beneath the surface. "Margaret," David's voice came through, laced with an unfamiliar tone. "We need to talk." I could hear the guilt in his voice, the tension that had replaced the usual arrogance. He was starting to feel the weight of his decisions. "Talk about what, David?" I asked coolly. "There's nothing left to discuss." I've made a mistake," he admitted, the words coming slowly, almost as if they tasted bitter in his mouth. "I've been thinking a lot, and I realize I've lost everything, my family, my home, and now I'm losing you. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. I should have never left you. I want to fix this." I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the lush garden, the sunlight streaming through the leaves. It was hard to even process his words. For so many years, I had tried to make him see the value of what we had, to make him understand the sacrifices I had made. And now, when I had finally found the courage to walk away, he wanted to come back and fix everything? "David," I said quietly, my voice firm but calm. You don't get to fix this. You don't get to come back into my life just because you made a mess of yours. You're not the victim here, David. You had your chance, and you blew it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear him scrambling for the right words. But I didn't let him speak. I wasn't giving him that power anymore. I've rebuilt my life, David. I found a new strength I never knew I had. And you made your bed with Emily, and now you have to lie in it. He sighed heavily, and I could feel the desperation seeping through the phone. Please, Margaret, you have to understand. Emily, she's not what I thought she was. I was foolish. I thought she could fill the void, but now I realize that I don't want her. I want you. I paused before responding. I could have let my anger get the best of me. I could have raged at him for the betrayal, for the hurt he caused, but I didn't. Instead, I made it clear to him that I wasn't the same woman anymore. The woman who had poured herself into their marriage without question was gone. The woman who had been there for him, through thick and thin, who had given up everything for their family, she had died the moment he walked out on me. No, David, I said slowly, making sure my words landed with full impact. I'm not going to be your backup plan. I'm not going to play second fiddle to some younger woman. You made your choice, and now you'll live with the consequences. There was silence on the other end of the phone. It wasn't the usual silence I had come to expect after one of his rants. This was different. It was filled with realization, with the dawning horror that he had truly lost me. You don't understand, Margaret, he said, his voice shaking. You think you can just move on and forget everything? You think you can just— I think I can, I interrupted. And I think you need to accept that. I'm done with you. I'm done trying to fix something that was never really broken. You were the one who broke it, David. He hung up before he could say anything more. I didn't need to listen to his pleas. His words didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was the power I had reclaimed, the control I had taken back. A week later, I received a message from one of David's business associates. The message was brief, but the words hit me hard. Margaret, I thought you should know, David's been having some trouble lately. His clients are pulling out and his reputation's taking a hit. Emily left him. She's not sticking around for this. I could hardly believe it. Emily, the woman he had left me for, had already walked away. The same woman who had promised him a new life had abandoned him as soon as the money started to dry up. It was the same pattern. David had always thought he could replace me, that he could build a better life with someone else. But it was clear now that he was starting to realize that what he had with me wasn't so easy to replace. I didn't take joy in his downfall, at least not in the way he probably expected. But I couldn't deny that the universe had a way of balancing things out. For years, I had been the one supporting him, watching him rise while I stayed behind. Now it seemed the tables were turning. David was losing everything, and I was winning. But I wasn't done yet. I still had one final card to play. As I sat in my new home, the weight of the past and the tension of the ongoing divorce behind me, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let David take anything else from me. I had spent far too long living in the shadows, waiting for approval and validation from him. Now I was going to take it all for myself, every penny, every inch of my own happiness. I wasn't just going to survive, I was going to thrive. I arranged a meeting with a real estate agent and started looking into properties to invest in. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't just want to secure my financial future. I wanted to build something bigger. Something that would serve as a permanent reminder that I had rebuilt my life on my own terms. And as for David, he had no idea what was coming next. The weeks following my confrontation with David felt like a whirlwind. The dust was settling in my new life, but a part of me still wasn't satisfied. I had claimed my independence, I had reclaimed my space, and I had finally started building the life I deserved. But there was still something lingering. David's betrayal still felt like a weight in the back of my mind. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt me anymore. It was the years of being ignored, belittled, and treated as if I were invisible. For so long, I had poured my heart into our marriage, into our family, and I had received nothing but selfishness in return. David had abandoned me for a younger woman, and he had believed that he could move on easily, that I would just sit by and take it. But I was done being the one who was left behind. And now it was time to take it all back. It was time for the payback. As I continued to adjust to my new life, I received a call from one of David's old colleagues, a man I had never really liked but who had always been cordial. His name was Victor, and he had been with David in the early days of the business. He had seen the rise of David's career, and he had witnessed the fall of their partnership. Margaret. Victor's voice was tight, almost apologetic. I heard what happened between you and David. Honestly, I'm sorry for all the hurt he's caused you. It was rare for someone to speak so openly about David's faults, especially someone in his inner circle. I had always known Victor wasn't entirely comfortable with the way David operated, but I hadn't expected this. "Thank you, Victor," I replied, my voice cool but appreciative. "But what are you calling for?" "I've heard some things, Margaret," he continued, "and I think you should know. David is in deep financial trouble. His business is falling apart and his clients are starting to back out. He's trying to keep up appearances, but it's only a matter of time before everyone sees the cracks. He's not the man he used to be, and it's catching up to him." I felt a small flicker of satisfaction. David was crumbling. The very empire he had built on my sacrifices was now collapsing without me. But this wasn't enough. I wanted more. I wanted him to feel what I had felt. "I'm sure that's difficult for him," I said, my voice dripping with the smallest hint of sarcasm. "But I'm sure he'll manage. He always has, hasn't he?" Victor seemed to hesitate, then added, "Margaret, I'm not trying to get in the middle of things, but I think it's time you knew." Emily left him. "She's not sticking around for this. She's already seeing someone else." A small laugh escaped my lips. Emily, the woman who had stolen David's attention, was already gone. She wasn't interested in sticking around when things got tough. It was just like David, to chase after someone who only saw him as a stepping stone to something better. "Thank you, Victor," I said, my voice unwavering. "I'll keep that in mind." I hung up the phone, a smile tugging at my lips. David had lost everything he thought he could have. The house, the business, the woman he had chosen over me. It was all slipping through his fingers. But I wasn't done yet. A few days later, I received a call from my lawyer, Helen. She had some news that I wasn't entirely surprised by, but it still made my pulse quicken. "Margaret," she began, "the legal paperwork has gone through. You're officially the co-owner of the house. David's attempts to claim it solely for himself have failed. The judge ruled in your favor. The house is yours." The words felt like music to my ears. The house, the one David had always acted like was his property alone, was now officially mine. I had won the first battle in this war of wills, and the victory felt sweet. But I didn't want to stop there. The house was just a symbol. It was the life I had built with him that I was really taking back. I wasn't just going to move in and go on with my life. I wanted to make a statement. I decided to renovate the house. It would be a project I would take on with my newfound wealth, using the trust fund to transform it into a space that reflected my strength, my taste, my success. This wasn't just about making the house beautiful. It was about reclaiming every corner of it, making it my own. While the renovations were underway, I decided it was time to make another major move, one that would hit David where it hurt the most: the business. David had always prided himself on his success, on how much he had built, on the legacy he had created. But the truth was, I had been a key part of that success, even if he never acknowledged it. Every late night I had spent managing our finances, every sacrifice I had made to support his career, those were the very foundations of the empire he had built. I made some discreet inquiries into the business, finding out who owned what, who held the majority of shares, and who was in charge of making decisions. And then I made a move that would cost him dearly. I began purchasing shares of his business, quietly, subtly. I knew the game, and I knew how to play it. David would never expect that his ex-wife would be the one to challenge his business empire. But this wasn't just about the money. It was about making David understand that everything he had built, everything he thought was his, had been built with my blood, sweat, and tears. Now it was time for me to take my rightful place in that legacy. A few days later, David called again. This time, his voice was more frantic, more desperate. "Margaret, what are you doing?" he demanded. "You're trying to ruin me. You're taking everything I worked for." I didn't respond right away. I could hear the panic in his voice, and it felt good to know that he was finally feeling the pressure. "David," I said softly, my voice laced with a calm certainty. "I'm not trying to ruin you. I'm just taking what's mine." There was silence on the other end of the line before he finally spoke again, his voice breaking. "You've made your point, Margaret. Please, just stop." But it was too late. The pieces were already in motion. The business, the house, the life we had built together. It was all mine now. And I was just getting started. It was as if a switch had flipped inside me. Every step I had taken so far, every decision, every moment of clarity, I could feel it all coming together. I was no longer the woman who had been abandoned and left to pick up the pieces. I had taken the shattered remnants of my life and transformed them into something unrecognizable, something far greater than I had ever imagined. But there was one more thing I had to do. David might have thought he could walk away from our marriage with no consequences. He had thought that his new life with Emily, his new business ventures, and his fresh start would somehow be a path to happiness. But as the walls began to close in around him, he was finally starting to see that his actions had real consequences. And that's when I decided it was time to bring down the hammer. I'd been quietly investing in shares of David's business over the last few months, making sure to remain below the radar. I didn't want him to know what I was doing. Not yet. I wanted him to believe he had control, to believe he was still the one pulling the strings. But I had plans. Big plans. It wasn't long before I had accumulated enough shares to become a significant player in the company. I knew David would be blindsided when he found out. But I wasn't just after a position or money. I was after his pride, his legacy, the thing he cared about most. One afternoon, I received a call from the board of directors of David's company. "Ms. Turner," the voice on the other end said, "we'd like to invite you to attend the next board meeting. We're discussing the future direction of the company, and as one of our major shareholders, your input would be valuable." I could hear the uncertainty in the woman's voice. The board had no idea what was coming. They didn't know that I was the one holding the cards now. I smiled to myself. David had always been the king of his little empire, but now he was about to see that his kingdom was no longer his to rule. The day of the meeting arrived, and I could feel the energy in the air as I walked into the corporate headquarters. The polished marble floors, the sleek glass conference rooms, everything screamed wealth and success. It had been David's world, his playground, but today it was mine. As I entered the boardroom, I saw David sitting at the head of the table, his usual air of confidence now replaced with a flicker of uncertainty. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I could see the flicker of panic in his gaze. The board members exchanged polite greetings as I took my seat, but I didn't say anything right away. I waited. I wanted David to sweat. Finally, the meeting began. The discussion was about the company's future, potential new investments, and the direction they wanted to take. But as the conversation progressed, I could feel David getting more and more uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. And then, it was my turn. "David," I said smoothly, my voice calm, "I think it's time for a change in leadership. Don't you?" The room fell silent. David's face turned pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "I've reviewed the company's financials," I continued, "and I think it's time we discuss some new strategies. The old ways aren't working anymore." The other board members exchanged glances, clearly unsure of where this was going. But I could see the doubt creeping into their minds. They had heard the whispers about David's leadership, his reckless spending, and his lack of foresight. They were looking for someone to step up. "I think it's clear that the company needs fresh leadership," I said, leaning forward, "and I'm willing to provide that leadership." David's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. He could feel the walls closing in on him. His empire, his pride, was slipping away, and I wasn't done yet. "I believe we need a vote," I said, turning to the other board members. "We need to discuss who will take over as CEO and how we can restructure to secure the future of the company." I could see the uncertainty growing in David's eyes. He wasn't the top dog anymore. The vote was quick. In less than 10 minutes, the board made their decision. David was out. The man who had built this company, the man who had always prided himself on his success, was officially removed from his position. The board unanimously agreed that the company needed a new direction, and they saw me as the future of the business. David sat there, stunned, speechless. His face was a mask of disbelief. He had spent years building this empire, and now it was mine. I had taken everything from him, piece by piece. I didn't even look at him as I stood up and addressed the room. "I'll be assuming the role of CEO from now on," I said, my voice steady and full of authority. "We'll begin restructuring immediately. I have some ideas for the company's future that will ensure its growth for many years to come." David's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The reality was finally sinking in. His world, the one he had spent decades building, was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As I walked out of the boardroom, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from David. "You've won, Margaret. You took everything from me. But I want you to know one thing. You'll regret this." I smiled to myself. David had always been so predictable. He thought he could control me, manipulate me into staying small, into staying in his shadow, but now it was clear. I had outgrown him. I sat in my car, staring out at the city skyline. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. David thought that by leaving me, by abandoning me, he would find happiness. But now, he was the one with nothing. The business, the house, the future we had once built together. It was all mine. The phone rang a few minutes later. It was David. "I should have never left you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." I could hear the desperation in his voice. The man who had once thought he could do no wrong was now begging for mercy, but there was no mercy left in me. "You were wrong, David," I said, my voice steady. "But it's too late. You made your choice, and now you'll have to live with it." "I can't believe this is happening," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I don't know who you are anymore." I paused for a moment, letting the weight of my words sink in. "I'm the woman who finally got her life back," I said, before hanging up. The days that followed the boardroom confrontation felt like a blur, but they were filled with a kind of peace I had never known before. David, once the man who controlled every aspect of my life, was now nothing more than a ghost. His empire, our empire, was gone, and I was the one holding the reins. I had done it. I had reclaimed my life in every possible way. The house, the business, the wealth, everything that had once been out of my reach was now mine. And yet, despite the feeling of triumph, there was still something that lingered deep inside me. A sense of justice had been served. But I knew that for David, this wasn't over. He had underestimated me, and now he would see the full extent of his mistake. This was my final payback. It was a week after the board meeting that I received an unexpected call from the bank. The voice on the other end was polite but formal, and the message was clear. Ms. Turner, we wanted to inform you that all debts associated with David's business have been transferred to your account. As per the recent restructuring, we've also secured additional assets under your name. I sat there for a moment, absorbing the information. I had made sure that every loose end was tied up. But this was the final blow. David had taken it all for granted. He thought he could walk away with the wealth, the reputation, and the life we had built together. But now, the debts from his failed ventures, his reckless spending, they were mine to control. I smiled to myself as I hung up the phone. David would never escape this. A few days later, I met with my financial advisor to review the final details of my assets. There were millions of dollars in the trust fund, multiple properties and shares in David's now faltering business. But it wasn't the money that brought me peace. It was the knowledge that I had fought for every inch of this life. I had worked hard, I had sacrificed, and now I had everything I deserved. And then, just as I was leaving my office, my phone buzzed again. I glanced down and saw David's name on the screen. I hesitated for only a moment before I answered. "Margaret, please," he pleaded, his voice hoarse. "I know I've lost everything. I know I was wrong, but I need your help. I'm in trouble. The business is collapsing and I don't know where to turn. Please. You're the only one who can help me." His voice was filled with desperation. But instead of the pity or sympathy I had once felt for him, I felt only a deep, unwavering sense of justice. He had thrown me away, he had betrayed me, and now he was begging me for help. "You should have thought about that before you walked out on me, David," I said calmly. "You made your choice, and now you have to live with it. I don't owe you anything, not anymore." David's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. He had no more control over me. His pleading, his remorse, they meant nothing now. "I think it's time for you to let go, David," I added softly. "Goodbye." And with that, I hung up. With David's desperate attempts fading into the past, I turned my attention to the future. The next phase of my life would be defined by me, and me alone. No longer would I live in the shadow of someone else's ambitions, of someone else's decisions. I was living for myself now. I decided to take a sabbatical, traveling to places I had always dreamed of visiting: Italy, Greece, Japan. I immersed myself in cultures, in new experiences. I took painting classes in Paris, wine tasting tours in Tuscany, and spent days by the sea in Greece, letting the water cleanse my soul. I also poured my energy into the business. I wasn't just the CEO now, I was the visionary. The company flourished under my leadership. I made bold moves, new investments, and transformed what had once been David's failing empire into something thriving, something innovative. David had left me a shadow of the person I was meant to be. But now, I was creating my own legacy. A year passed. I was sitting in my new office, overlooking the city skyline from my penthouse suite, when the door opened. I didn't have to look up to know who it was. David stood there, looking disheveled, his face lined with regret and defeat. He'd clearly hit rock bottom, and yet he still couldn't seem to stay away. He had come to seek closure, or perhaps to find some way to crawl back into my life. "I know you don't want to hear this," he began, his voice low and almost broken. "But I've lost everything. The business, the house, Emily. I've hit rock bottom. I don't have anywhere else to go." I didn't say anything at first. I let him stand there in the doorway, squirming in his own misery. He had walked out on me once, and now he was begging for a second chance. Finally, I spoke. "You should have thought about that before you left me," I said softly, looking up at him. You should have thought about the consequences before you destroyed everything. The truth is, you were never a man who appreciated what you had, and now you have nothing." He looked at me, his eyes filled with guilt, but there was no sympathy in me anymore. David had destroyed himself, and he had done it without my help. "I don't want anything from you, David. I've built my own life, and I'm finally happy. You were a part of that life once, but not anymore. Not now." David's shoulders slumped, and he turned to leave. But before he stepped out the door, he stopped and looked back one last time. "Goodbye, Margaret," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." I nodded, my expression unreadable. "Goodbye, David," I replied. As the door closed behind him, I exhaled. It was over. The past was finally behind me, and I had made it through stronger, better, and more powerful than I had ever been before. In the years that followed, I continued to flourish. I built my business into one of the most successful in the industry, made lifelong friends, and even met someone who truly appreciated me for who I was. Love, when it came, was on my terms. I never forgot the lessons I learned from my marriage. I never forgot the pain David caused me. But I also never forgot the strength I found in myself after everything fell apart. I was living my best life now, and there was no looking back.